All right, so get ready, because today we are going deep on moral relativism.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. It's this idea that, like, right and wrong,
Right.
they aren't,
Set in stone.
yeah, exactly, set in stone. They might actually depend on, like, your culture or the society you're living in.
Yeah, your context, the whole thing.
And it's not just some, like, dusty philosophy puzzle that only professors think about.
Right.
It's politicians.
Yeah.
It's religious leaders.
All the time.
Yeah, they're always kind of like wrestling with this stuff.
Yeah.
So it gets to, the core of how we make decisions, both big and small.
I think what's fascinating about moral relativism is that it really challenges, I think, our natural instinct
Oh, yeah.
to assume that, like, there's one right way to see the world.
Totally.
It forces us to confront this possibility that other perspectives, even ones that seem strange or even wrong to us,
Mm-hmm.
might have their own internal logic and coherence.
Okay, so before we, get too far down this rabbit hole,
Sure.
let's actually just define some terms.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we often hear people say, like, that's just your opinion, right?
Oh, right.
But what if moral judgments are actually kind of like opinions
Yeah.
in the sense that they're really tied to the group that you're a part of?
Right.
That's where moral relativism, I think, kind of comes in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, let's start with, like, this simple observation,
Okay.
which we'll call descriptive moral relativism.
Catchy.
DMR, for short.
Okay, DMR. Got it.
So this is just the idea that different society, like, they actually have some pretty wild disagreements about what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about, like, table manners.
Okay, great.
We're talking about fundamental differences in values.
Like, give me an example. What kind of stuff are we talking about here?
So think about something like arranged marriages.
Okay.
So in some cultures, it's seen as perfectly normal,
Yeah.
even desirable practice. But in other cultures, it's viewed as, like, a huge violation of individual freedom.
Okay, interesting.
Or you think about punishments for blasphemy.
Okay.
So some societies have strict laws against insulting religious figures,
Right.
while others value freedom of speech above, almost all else.
Yeah, that's a really big difference.
And these aren't just, like, minor quibbles.
Right.
They reflect, I think, deep-seated differences in moral priorities.
I see what you mean. But I think some folks would say that these differences are actually overblown.
Yeah.
They would argue that deep down, like, everyone values,
Yes.
things like fairness or compassion.
That's a common counter-argument, and it leads to a really interesting question, which is, how much disagreement can there really be
Okay.
before we're not even talking about the same moral concepts anymore?
Right.
Can we truly understand a culture's idea of justice
Yeah.
if their whole system is built on principles that just seem completely alien to us?
So even understanding another culture's morals
Hmm.
gets really tricky if their starting point is just drastically different from ours.
Right.
But doesn't that make DMR kind of self-defeating?
Yeah.
Because if we can't actually understand each other's moral codes,
Yeah.
how can we even really say that they're different?
That's a sharp point.
Yeah.
And I think it highlights how even observing these moral differences requires some level of shared understanding.
Right.
Like, we need this common language, even if we're using that language to express different ideas.
Okay, so DMR says that different cultures have different morals, right?
Right.
Got it.
Yeah.
But then we get to the really juicy stuff, right? Meta-ethical moral relativism.
Yeah.
MMR for the cool kids. What makes MMR different? And why does it tend to freak people out?
I think MMR takes things a step further.
Okay.
It's not just saying, hey, different strokes for different folks, right?
Right.
It's suggesting that there might not be a universal yardstick
Oh.
for measuring right and wrong. In other words, moral truths might be relative to a particular person or group.
Hold on. So let me make sure I'm following you here.
Sure.
Are we saying that anything goes?
Okay.
Like, if a society decides that, let's say, human sacrifice is morally good,
Right.
does MMR just shrug and say, well, that's their truth?
So that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
And it gets, I think, to the heart of why MMR can feel so unsettling to people.
Yeah.
MMR isn't saying that morality is just arbitrary
Okay.
or that we can't judge other cultures.
Yep.
It's more about where we locate the source of moral truth.
Okay.
So for objectivists, which are kind of the opposite of relativists,
Right.
They say there are moral facts out there in the world,
Okay. Yeah.
independent of our beliefs or opinions.
So it's like gravity. Like, we don't get to vote on whether or not it exists. It is.
Exactly.
And so objectivists would say moral rules are kind of like that.
Exactly.
Right.
But for MMR, I think things are a lot more complex.
Okay.
A statement like, let's say, stealing is wrong, might be true within a particular moral framework,
Okay.
but not necessarily true in some absolute objective sense.
So for MMR folks, is it more like saying stealing is wrong
Mm-hmm.
according to the rules of this particular society?
Precisely.
Okay.
And MMR makes us ask, what makes a moral claim true?
Right.
Is it because it reflects some universal moral law?
Okay.
Or is it because it's consistent with the values and beliefs of a specific community?
Okay. This is starting to make my head spin a little bit.
Sure.
Are there different kinds of MMR?
Yeah.
Or is it just like a one-size-fits-all theory?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
MMR isn't like a single unified theory, right?
Okay.
There are actually different flavors of MMR,
Okay.
each with its own subtle variation.
Okay. Now we're getting to the good stuff.
Right.
Break it down for me. What are these different flavors and why do those differences matter?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so we've got these different flavors of MMR.
Yeah.
It's like we walked into a moral ice cream shop.
Right.
What are our choices?
Well, one key distinction is whether MMR is about the truth of moral claims or about how we justify them.
Okay.
Some argue that moral claims can be true or false,
Okay.
but only relative to a particular moral framework.
Okay.
Others focus on how we arrive at our moral beliefs,
Right.
emphasizing the role of culture, upbringing, social norms, all that.
So like one flavor is saying the ice cream is objectively chocolate or vanilla, but which flavor you like depends on your taste buds,
Right.
which are shaped by your culture.
Yeah.
But the other flavor is saying there is no objective chocolate or vanilla, just different ways that people experience the same swirl of creamy stuff.
That's a delicious analogy.
I try.
And it highlights the difference, I think, between focusing on the content of moral beliefs versus the process by which we form those beliefs.
Okay, I'm getting a brain freeze here.
Okay.
Another scoop, please.
Right.
What other distinctions do we need to sort out within MMR?
Another important question is, do we judge actions based on our own moral standards or the standards of the people we're judging?
Okay.
And this gets to the heart of how we approach moral disagreements across cultures.
So if I'm judging a historical figure, do I use the moral standards of their time?
Right.
Or do I hold them to my modern-day ideas of right and wrong?
Exactly.
MMR makes that choice seem a lot less obvious.
Yeah, precisely. And this ties into yet another distinction.
Oh, okay.
Which is MMR simply describing how things are, or is it telling us how we should think about morality?
Okay, time for a palate cleanser.
Okay.
I think I'm getting a bit lost in the MMR swirl.
Sure.
Explain it like I'm back in Philosophy 101.
Okay.
What's the core issue here?
I think the core issue is whether MMR is just an observation about moral diversity
Okay.
or whether it's a prescription for how we ought to approach moral issues.
Yeah.
Is it saying, hey, look, morality is messy and relative?
Right.
Or is it saying we should be tolerant of other cultures' morals because there's no single right answer?
Ah, okay, I'm tasting that now.
Okay.
So it's the difference between describing moral relativism and actually endorsing it as the right way to think about ethics.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of the debate between moral relativists and their opponents.
Speaking of opponents, if moral disputes could always be settled by logic and facts, MMR wouldn't have such a strong pull, right?
Right.
But can we really resolve these deep moral clashes definitively?
Yeah.
If so, wouldn't that kind of make relativism irrelevant?
That's a great question, and it brings us to the heart of the debate between objectivism and relativism.
Okay.
So, as we touched on earlier, objectivists believe that moral truths exist independent of our opinions.
Right.
They argue that disagreements usually arise from ignorance or faulty reasoning.
Okay.
In their view, if we were all perfectly rational and well-informed, we'd eventually reach a consensus on these moral issues.
So the objectivist is like the ultimate referee, saying, hold on, folks, there's one right call here, and I've got the rule book to prove it.
That's a good way to put it. Objectivists often point to scientific progress as a model for moral reasoning.
Okay.
Just as we've discovered objective truths about the physical world,
Right.
they believe we can discover objective truths about morality as well.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But honestly, haven't we all had arguments where it felt like no amount of evidence would change the other person's mind?
Right.
Doesn't that suggest that something deeper is going on?
Yeah.
Something more than just a lack of information or logical thinking?
That's a really insightful point, and it's precisely what proponents of MMR emphasize.
Okay.
They argue that even when people are highly intelligent and well-intentioned,
Yeah.
they can still reach different moral conclusions because they're operating from different moral frameworks.
Okay.
These frameworks, shaped by culture, upbringing, personal experiences,
Right.
they act like lenses through which we interpret the world,
Yeah.
including the moral world.
So it's like we're wearing different moral glasses.
Yeah.
And those glasses affect how we see the same situation. What looks crystal clear through one lens might appear blurry or distorted through another.
Exactly. And this leads to the idea of incommensurable moral frameworks.
Incommensurable.
Frameworks that are so fundamentally different that we lack the common ground to even judge which one is better or more correct.
Incommensurable. Okay, that one is going on my vocab list for sure.
Right.
But if these moral frameworks are so different, doesn't that make genuine dialogue and compromise almost impossible?
That's a challenge I think that MMR has to address.
Yeah.
But even if we can't always find a single right answer that everyone agrees on,
Right.
MMR doesn't necessarily render moral debate pointless.
Okay.
It can still help us understand the roots of our disagreements, encourage empathy for other perspectives,
Right.
and maybe even lead to some practical solutions, even if we don't reach full agreement on the underlying principles.
I can see that.
Yeah.
But hold on. If right and wrong just depend on the group you're in, what's the point of even having moral arguments?
Yeah.
Isn't it just like arguing about which flavor of ice cream is objectively the best?
That's a common critique of MMR. And it gets to the heart of whether it leads to kind of a moral apathy or nihilism.
Right.
But MMR advocates would argue that while there might not be a single correct answer
Okay.
that applies to everyone in all situations,
Right.
there can still be relative truth
Okay.
and meaningful disagreement within a particular moral framework.
So it's like saying, okay, maybe there's no universal rule about whether pineapple belongs on pizza,
Right.
but we can still have a spirited debate about it within the community of pizza lovers.
Exactly. And those debates can be productive and lead to changes in social norms and practices,
Okay.
even if they're grounded in a relative moral framework.
Okay, I'm starting to see how MMR can still allow for passionate moral debate,
Yeah.
even if it rejects the idea of absolute truth.
Right.
But what about actions that seem universally condemned, like genocide
Yeah.
or the Holocaust?
Right.
Can MMR really account for those?
Yeah.
Doesn't that kind of push us toward the limits of relativism?
It does. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it? The Holocaust.
Yeah, definitely.
How can any moral system, especially one that says morality is relative,
Right.
deal with something so undeniably horrific?
Yeah.
It feels like this is where MMR might just hit a wall.
You're right. This is one of the most serious challenges to moral relativism, I think.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront, the darkest chapters of human history
Right.
and ask whether any framework that denies those absolute moral truths can adequately condemn such atrocities.
So how do MMR proponents even begin to approach this?
Right.
Does it just boil down to saying, well, the Nazis had their own messed up morality, and who are we to judge?
It's definitely not that simple.
Okay.
First off, I think it's crucial to remember that MMR, at its core, is a descriptive and analytical framework.
Okay.
It's attempting to explain how moral judgments work
Right.
and why there's so much diversity in those judgments.
Yeah.
It's not a system that tells you what to believe or how to act.
Okay, so it's not giving a thumbs up to genocide.
Right.
It's more like trying to understand how people,
Right.
even people doing terrible things, see the world
Yeah.
and justify their actions within their own, twisted logic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
MMR doesn't condone anything.
Oh, yeah.
It simply tries to make sense of the fact that even the most heinous acts can be rationalized within a particular moral framework.
Okay.
It's a bit like studying a virus under a microscope.
Okay.
We don't study viruses because we like them.
Oh,
we
yeah.
study them to understand how they work so we can fight them.
That's a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah.
So MMR isn't about approving of evil.
No.
It's about understanding the mechanisms of moral reasoning,
Right.
even when those mechanisms lead to, terrible outcomes.
Right.
But does that mean we just throw up our hands and say, well, nothing is truly wrong, it's all relative?
Right.
How does MMR allow us to actually condemn something like the Holocaust?
This is where things get really complex, I think.
Yep.
MMR proponents would likely argue that even within Nazi Germany, there was dissent.
Right.
There were people who risked their lives to oppose the regime and its policies,
Okay.
often appealing to these universal principles of human dignity and justice.
That's true.
Yeah.
Even in the darkest of times, there are always those, flickers of light, people who refuse to conform to the prevailing morality.
Right.
But doesn't that suggest those dissenters were tapping into some kind of objective moral truth?
It might.
A truth that transcended the, twisted Nazi framework?
That's a question that has fueled many, many debates.
Yeah.
This near universal condemnation of the Holocaust,
Right.
even across cultures with vastly different moral traditions,
Yeah.
I think could suggest that we do have some deep-seated, maybe even innate revulsion towards certain acts.
Okay.
And whether that revulsion can be grounded in a rational, objective, moral framework, or whether it's more of an emotional response, is a question that philosophers continue to wrestle with.
So the Holocaust really pushes MMR to its limits.
I think it does.
It forces us to consider whether there are some acts that are so fundamentally wrong
Right.
that they break free of the relativity of cultures and time periods.
Yeah.
It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
We've been talking about cultures and societies, but MMR has to deal with another tricky question.
Yeah.
Whose morals actually count?
Right.
We all belong to multiple groups.
Yeah.
Family, nation, religion,
Yeah.
even our online communities, right?
Right.
And those groups don't always see eye to eye on ethical matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so how does MMR handle that?
You've hit on another key challenge for MMR.
Okay.
It needs a way to clearly define, the relevant moral group or framework.
Okay.
If it can't do that, it risks collapsing into a kind of individualistic free-for-all,
Right.
where each person becomes their own moral universe.
So instead of live and let live, it becomes every person for themselves.
Right, exactly.
Doesn't that undermine the whole point of morality,
Yeah,
which is about how we share values and live together peaceful?
that's the worry.
Yeah.
If MMR can't provide this coherent account of how these individual moral judgments
Right.
relate to the broader social fabric, it loses a lot of its explanatory power.
Okay.
It becomes less about understanding shared morals
Right.
and more about individual whims.
So MMR is walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
It has to acknowledge the reality of moral diversity
Right.
without dissolving into a kind of moral anarchy
Right.
where everyone just makes up their own rules.
Exactly. Finding that balance is, I think, the key to developing a robust and defensible version of moral relativism.
Okay, let's assume for a moment that MMR can handle those challenges.
Okay.
That it can account for things like the Holocaust
Right.
and give a good explanation of which group matters.
Okay. Yeah.
Is there any middle ground between total MMR and total objectivism? Can we have our moral cake and eat it too?
That's a good question.
Can we acknowledge the real differences between cultures while still holding on to the idea that some things are just plain wrong, no matter where or when you live?
Some philosophers believe that we can, in fact, find that middle ground.
Okay.
One approach is to say that some moral truths are objective, but only in this very basic foundational sense.
Okay.
Think of it like a moral constitution.
Interesting.
There are certain core principles,
Okay.
like avoiding unnecessary harm or promoting well-being,
Yeah.
and those kind of provide the bedrock for any decent moral system.
Okay.
But within those broad guidelines, there's room for cultural variation and interpretation.
So kind of like a moral operating system.
Right.
Every computer needs a basic OS to function, but you can customize it with different apps and settings depending on your needs and preferences.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
This approach allows us to acknowledge the diversity of human values and practices while still holding on to this idea that some moral principles are just universal and non-negotiable.
I like that.
Yeah.
It feels like a way to respect both the common humanity that binds us
Right.
and the unique cultural expressions that make us who we are.
Exactly.
Are there any other attempts to kind of bridge the gap between MMR and objectivism?
Another interesting approach is what philosopher David Wong calls pluralistic relativism.
Okay.
He argues that while there might not be one single correct morality,
Okay.
there are these objective limits on what a good moral system can look like.
Okay.
And these limits are rooted in human nature,
Okay.
the need for social cooperation,
Right.
and the basic requirements of a flourishing society.
So it's like saying there are certain rules of the game for morality.
Right.
But within those rules, different cultures can develop different strategies and play styles.
Exactly. And those strategies might involve prioritizing, individual rights,
Okay.
communal harmony,
Right.
religious devotion, or any number of other values.
This pluralistic relativism is really intriguing.
Yeah.
It acknowledges both the objective constraints of human nature
Right.
and the creative freedom that allows cultures to develop these diverse moral expressions.
Yeah.
But does this compromise truly hold up under scrutiny?
Right.
Does it feel intellectually satisfying?
Yeah.
Or are we trying to have it both ways?
Yeah.
It's a question worth pondering as we wrap up our deep dive into moral relativism.
Indeed, moral relativism in all its flavors is a complex and often controversial topic.
Absolutely.
It challenges us to think deeply about the nature of right and wrong,
Right.
the role of culture in shaping our values,
Yeah,
and the possibilities and limits of moral progress.
it does.
It's a journey that can be both unsettling and enlightening.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the foundations of our own beliefs
Yeah.
and to engage with perspectives that might initially seem strange or even threatening.
It's definitely been a mind-bending journey.
It has.
We've gone from ancient Greek philosophers to modern anthropologists. From the seemingly simple observation of cultural differences
Right.
to the mind-boggling implications of relative truth.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
We've unpacked different flavors of MMR, wrestled with the challenge of the Holocaust,
Right.
and even tried to find that middle ground between relativism and objectivism.
And along the way, we've hopefully given you, our listener, plenty to chew on as you continue your own explorations of this fascinating and enduring topic.
I hope so.
Absolutely. Moral relativism doesn't offer easy answers.
Yeah.
It raises more questions than it answers.
Yeah,
But that's precisely what makes it so valuable.
I agree.
It pushes us out of our comfort zones, forces us to confront our assumptions,
Really?
and invites us to engage in this thoughtful and respectful dialogue
Yeah.
with those who hold different views.
And ultimately, that's what philosophy is all about, right? This
Yeah.
ongoing pursuit of wisdom,
Yeah.
understanding,
Yeah.
and a more just and compassionate world.
Well said.
Thank-
We'll leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
If at least some aspects of morality are relative,
Right.
does that make us more tolerant of other cultures?
Yeah.
Or does it make it harder to stand up against practices we find truly harmful?
Ooh, that's a good one.
That tension, that challenge,
Yeah.
it's at the heart of what makes moral relativism such a rich and relevant topic.
Absolutely.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those philosophical wheels turning.
Keep thinking.
All right, that's it for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here.